In this presentation, we will be discussing net assets versus net position and operating statements with regard to colleges and universities. We're going to start off with the comparison of net assets and net position. When we think of net assets, we're talking about FASB or non-governmental institutions, the private institutions. When we're thinking about net position, we're thinking about those governmental institutions, the universities that are governmental institutions. Now, in many ways, these two things are basically similar. When we think about assets minus liabilities, we call the other section equity if it's a for-profit organization, which might be owner's equity if it's a sole proprietor. It might be partner's equity if it's a partnership. It might be stockholders' equity if it's a corporation. And now if it's basically a governmental entity that's going to be governed by GASB, then it's going to be called net position. And if it's going to be a non-governmental entity, then it's going to be called net assets. And that's typically the wording that we would have for a not-for-profit organization that's non-governmental, net assets, and a governmental type of entity, which would be the net position. So it's really just kind of a terminology kind of thing that we're talking about. If we're thinking about the double entry accounting system, then we are simply thinking about that third category, kind of like the equity section, assets, liabilities, and what are we going to call equity? Net assets, equity, net position. So FASB, net position, FASB, net assets, GASB, net position. Within the net assets, we're then going to have the subcategories. So you're thinking about the balance sheet or the trial balance within what would be similar to the equity section, here being the net position section. We're going to have a breakout then within the without donor restrictions. So that'll be called net assets without donor restrictions. And then we'll have net assets with donor restrictions. So within that basically kind of equity section, if you think about the assets minus the liabilities, that leaves us with the net assets in this case. That's what we're going to call it in this case. That net assets is what we might think of that we want to use. We want to basically spend and allocate in the future. We're going to break those net assets then out into those which have restrictions with donor restrictions and those that do not. As we actually work example problems and post to these accounts, it'll be a lot more clear. Then we have the net position for GASB. So same kind of idea. So we have assets minus liability now is net position. We have categorizations once again within that of net position category, within what would be similar to equity, which we're now breaking out into some components, subcomponents of what would be similar to equity, the net position. Those will include unrestricted and restricted. So note the terminology different, the concept much the same, very similar. And then we also have another category, which is going to be net investment in capital assets. And so again, you can think of this concept as we have the assets minus the liabilities. That gives us in essence what would be the equity or the net assets, or in this case, a net position. And that's what people might want to choose to kind of look at and allocate to future, allocate those resources somewhere in the future. The governmental accounting is going to say, hey, I want to break out this information. Some of these net assets represent assets that we can't readily spend because they're in capital assets. They're in property, plant, and equipment. So we want to basically tell the reader, hey, there's unrestricted assets that are the net assets, the net position that you can think about possibly doing something with in the future. We have those that are restricted, which in essence, those net assets are already, those net position assets are already designated in some way or have some restrictions upon them. And then we also have the net position, the net assets, assets minus liability, net position, that represent basically assets that you can't spend. You can't designate them to something because they're capital assets, they're long-lived assets. You're not going to be able to basically designate them towards something other than that. Now, we will take a look at the operating statements, kind of like the income type statements for the colleges and university. These are going to be the performance statements. How are we doing over time type of statements? Same kind of breakout. We've got the FASB, non-governmental, and the GASB, which will be the governmental type of entities. So under the FASB, we could use a single step or a multiple step. So we can break it out into just one single step, and that'll be easier to use if we're giving this to individuals that aren't as familiar with looking at financial statements. It might be easier to do the single step, or if we can break it out in a multiple step. Net assets released from restrictions is going to be a component of the operating statement. So in other words, we're going to have the net assets that were restricted. They're typically restricted when the donor gives the asset to the institution, or they're restricted at some point when the revenue, in essence, is generated. Is there some type of restriction as the revenue is being generated? Then, at some future point, if we comply or if we do whatever is needed, or spend the money on whatever the required money is spent on in order to unrestrict something, we will have the net assets released from restriction. When we have the operating statement under this format, we'll typically see two columns in the operating statement, one with the restricted and one with the unrestricted, and then we'll have the total, a third column that will basically total them up. When we release from restriction, that's going to show the items that are going to be unrestricted, and they're going to be coming out of the column that will be restricted, decreasing that column. They'll be increasing the column related to unrestricted at that point in time. This is similar to what we have seen in other non-governmental, not-for-profit entities. With the GASB, when we're talking about the governmental type of entities with regards to the schools and colleges and universities, we have a separately reported operating and non-operating activities. So separately reported operating and non-operating activities, and statement of revenues, expenses, and changes in net position.